you, Prof. Thank you so much. Cool. Thank you, Prof. Thank you for the opportunity to present here. I've got a pretty complicated setup here that I'll just share with you, just in case anything goes wrong. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to record myself, also have my phone hooked up to the mic, and in the process trying to create visibility for you guys. And then on top of that, I also want to record my screen as well. So part of the challenge is to also get that going. Okay. And then use my iPad to control my screen. So it's very ambitious in terms of, I've never done this stack before, but let's hope it works. It looks like it's working, so that's great. Yeah, so thanks for having me, guys. I actually just got reminded in 2016, the first time I ever stepped foot in this class was when I tried to join Tuck's debating union. Is anyone here part of Tuck's debating union? Show of hands, no one's tried it. Okay. I remember, I stepped in, and the whole debating notion, if I recall correctly, was I had to argue against the notion that the feminist movement should renounce feminism. A double negative, first year, and I didn't even know what feminism was, let alone needing to debate it. So, yeah, needless to say, that was a bit of a train smash. I actually never ended up staying in the debating union. So yeah, I've got a bit of trauma from this lecture hall. Anyway, here I am, many years later, presenting to you guys what is a concept that is genuinely powerful, and something that I wish was actually taught to me when I was your age. Not quite in the workforce yet, moving towards, most of you are moving towards joining most likely a big corporate company, and you're learning the content in your course, but you don't really know what to expect when it comes to how humans collaborate across complex systems. Okay? So I think there are going to be some nuggets of knowledge here, and terms especially, that I guarantee you're going to run into again when you guys start earning your first salaries. Some of you are going to end up working for big banks. Fewer of you are going to end up working for small startups and get exposed to these very core concepts. But nevertheless, what I'm about to teach you today is actually one of the most prevalent work management methodologies in terms of how humans collaborate for a collective outcome. Cool. So currently, thank you for the awesome intro, by the way, Prof. Really appreciate it. So you already know I'm currently the head of platform at Easy Equities. On the 4th of May the 4th be with you, I'll always remember that, we actually hit 100 billion in AUM, which is quite a milestone in terms of how much money is invested with us. Very exciting. And then we also have the largest number of clients in South Africa as far as a brokerage is concerned. We don't have the biggest AUM, but in terms of sheer number of clients, sheer number of South Africans investing with us, we win on that count margin. So other investment houses might have bigger AUM because they have a concentrated amount of very high net worth individuals whose books they are managing. But from a pure distribution perspective, Easy Equities is actually leading the charge. Another little bit about me is I taught AIM at the University of Pretoria while I was doing my master's in financial management sciences. That's the name of your degree, right? Okay, cool. Yeah, so I actually did my honors in investment management, and then after that, I stuck around doing MCOM, and then my side hustle was AIM, and I've actually never left academia. I've been in academia since, so currently at the University of Cape Town, and then my graduation ceremony for my second master's in IT is taking place in September. So what I'm going to show you today is share sort of a little bit of that intersection between what you guys are doing, which is very relevant to what I do, the intersection between IT, which spans all organizations, even if you end up in what you're studying now, or a peripheral field of that, you'll still come across this. And then, of course, the science of how humans collaborate as well as complexity. So I decided to create a bit of an incentive structure for you guys, because I'm really hoping you guys are willing to ask questions. Okay? So I've got 8 Cadburys here, but I'm only going to dish them out if I receive a good question. Okay? So I highly encourage you. I do like chocolate, so I'm also incentivized to deem your question a dumb question and not give you the chocolate. But seriously, I was always taught in university there's no such thing as a dumb question. Who believes that? Who believes there's no such thing as a dumb question? Okay, I mean, there's an argument to be made. I think curiosity is underrated, and dumb questions are a manifestation of curiosity. I think there are dumb questions, especially in a workplace setting, less so in an academic setting. So ask away, but just a friendly bit of advice: if you are in a big meeting with executives and you ask a dumb question does exist. Okay. All right, cool. So please, guys, I think honestly this lecture will be slightly disappointing for me if all I do is just go through my slides and you guys haven't asked me anything, and I have 8 chocolates when I get home. So please, butt in, raise your hand, earn yourself a chocolate, and then let's see how it goes, because I think I'll be able to riff on this content better and talk about the underlying literature without boring you if you engage with me. So please keep that in mind. So I encourage everyone to think about questions. But I'm first going to pose a few questions to you, just so I can sort of gauge, maybe some of you do know what the underlying content is that I'm about to present on. Does anyone know actually what is Agile work? Has the term Agile ever crossed your ears in terms of startup culture? Do any of you know what a startup is? Ooh, there we go.
Okay, I'm not 100% sure, but I think Agile workers mean you know that change is inevitable, so instead of resisting it, you sort of leverage that change that's coming, in that context.
Okay, I like that. So she's saying Agile is basically an acknowledgement of a situation where change is inevitable. I mean, change is the only constant in all organizations. I quite like that definition. There are elements of truth in that, but what Agile is basically the crux of what I'm going to be teaching to you today. When you guys enter the workforce, you're going to see elements of the Agile work methodology all over the show, and you're going to come across these terms right here. So Agile is the name of the most prevalent and popular work and collaboration methodology that exists in companies across the spectrum. You see it especially prevalent in modern Silicon Valley tech companies, and it's being rapidly adopted, or at least attempted to be adopted, by big corporations. Even big financial corporations in South Africa are using these Agile ceremonies to collaborate across interdepartments and cross-functional teams to deliver a collective outcome. So if I had to describe Agile work, a great way to remember it in terms of a very simplistic heuristic, it is a iterative loop. Think of a loop that goes in a repeat process, which is directly contrasted to the waterfall methodology. So if I say waterfall methodology pitted against an Agile methodology, what comes to mind? What would a waterfall work methodology entail if an Agile methodology is iterative? That's correct. So think about a waterfall. It's only going in one direction. So a waterfall methodology typically is a phase-gated approach where you've got a requirement in whatever organization or outcome it is you're trying to achieve. Then you've got your design, your solution design, followed by building the solution or moving forward with whatever needs to be solved to achieve it, testing that thing, and then typically maintaining it. So it's very linear. So Agile is a loop, waterfall is phase-gated, and it's unidirectional. Okay, cool. So keep that in mind because it's very important. I had to start off with this core terminology. Hopefully you carry it with you as you guys enter the workforce because you will come across this. Then the most common terminologies you'll come across in a company that claims to use an agile collaboration methodology is a sprint. Okay? So a sprint is basically a fixed short time box, usually 1 to 4 weeks, commonly 2 weeks, in which an agile team commits to deliver a small working slice of value. So it specifically starts with planning and it ends with a review. Okay? The review is the retrospective, and specifically the review is part of this exploratory process of solving complexity that looks at the process in which the problem was approached and tries to refine the process of problem solving itself. Okay? And I'll elaborate a little bit more about that. Has anyone ever heard of an epic? No? Not even in an academic lens. What an epic is, that's okay. I also didn't know what it was. So think of an epic as a parent taxonomy, like an umbrella term for a large body of work, which is typically too big to finish in one sprint. And just a reminder, the sprint is that period of collaboration where you and your team set out to deliver whatever it is the company needs you to deliver. Okay? So think of an epic as a big chapter, right? If your degree is the outcome, you're trying to get your degree, think of an epic as one of your modules, right? It's a very big deliverable, and it's got sub-deliverables within it. Okay, so that's an epic. And then these are terms that I urge you to remember, because you will come across them today. And then finally, a very important bit of information in terms of agile work culture are the ceremonies followed by teams in order to deliver this agile work methodology. So what you'll typically hear, or what you will join one day, is either what they call a daily stand-up or a scrum. Okay? So the scrum and stand-up are terms that are used interchangeably, and they're usually very short 15-minute meetings where you just catch up with your team in the morning and you answer 3 core questions. What did I do yesterday? What will I be doing today? And what's blocking me? Okay? I still come across people who don't actually understand that a stand-up is meant to be a very short update. Some people give long stand-up updates. That's kind of something you want to avoid. Keep in mind, stand-ups really should be kept down to 15 minutes overall, and confined to a team that basically can be shared across one pizza. That's the general rule of thumb. Things get messy the moment you start expanding the size of a team, and I'm going to explain a little bit more of that shortly as well. Okay, cool. So what am I presenting on? This doesn't look like your typical PowerPoint presentation, does it? So what I'm actually presenting on is one of the things you will come across in an agile workforce, which is what we call a Kanban board. So Kanban is the original name of a process-based column structure where tasks move between states and they are assigned to team members and they are tracked accordingly. Okay? It's got rich history, it's got deep roots, and it's very relevant to the agile work methodology. So as you can see here, the content of my presentation I've elected as a Kanban board. So I've gone through my first ticket here, and the next ticket, just for sake of familiarizing yourself with the Kanban board, which is something you will come across, is now here. All right, cool. So the evolution of work has very much evolved, especially if you look over the past 70 years about how managers used to typically solve complex problems through Gantt charts, which is the chart that you see here on the left, and then following inspiration actually from Gantt as well as roots in the Toyota car manufacturing company, things started to actually progress towards this Kanban column structure, which typically has columns like to do, in progress, done, and it's assigned to people. Okay? And then as technology evolved, the whole process of having your 3 columns moved from being on some kind of diagram that was visible on a wall somewhere to entering the digital realm, which is literally what I'm presenting to you on now. I'm presenting to you on a Kanban board, which is sort of the modern form of how tasks are managed across teams. So it's very, very relevant. But there are some interesting things that have changed throughout the evolution of how humans collaborate and how we triumph and solve complex problems. The first thing that was an interesting deviation throughout the evolution was the concept of visibility and who could see the work. So throughout history, managers in strict hierarchies were typically the gatekeepers and the custodians of progress in a project. A manager would have the Gantt chart in his office, right? And then he would be the one that delegates the tasks that need to take place. And typically workers didn't really have eyes on the broader thing because they were focused on the lower level vision of it all. And that has been happening for quite a long time. And what has happened through the evolution of Kanban and the Agile work methodology is this gradual decentralization of visibility and assignee autonomy. So that's sort of where you see an increase in cadence, and why it's so popular across the world is the more you empower teams to solve problems and understand the problems, and assign not only who works on the solutions, but the solutions themselves to teams, you find way better results, and specifically you find significantly improved cadence. And cadence really matters in the private sector, because once you enter the workforce, you are going to be, especially the private sector, you're going to be put under a lot of pressure to deliver. Okay, cool. So if I quickly just go through the timeline of how this all unfolded with you. So it actually started in 1910. That's sort of where the Gantt chart was born by a gentleman called Henry Gantt, and it was popularized in World War I. So basically it took this like top-down approach. It was used specifically in the beginning for US munition production. And again, that whole concept of visibility that I explained was initially hidden from the laborers, and it was strictly a management tool. Okay? Then you fast forward to the 1950s, and you start seeing the evolution of PERT and CPM diagrams. PERT being a program evaluation and review technique, and I think CPM is critical path. Do you guys do critical path in any of your modules? I remember doing it in my undergrad. Anyway, so critical path method is basically a method where the path of most complexity and shortest path to completion is mapped out as a sequence of events. It overlaps with the concept of Gantt, and I'll show you what a PERT and CPM diagram looks like shortly. But it was created by the US Navy, specifically when they were working on the Polaris submarine project. And the main thing where the evolution of work evolved in the 1950s was there was a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of moving away from the Gantt concept of purely tracking time and moving towards the concept of tracking dependencies. And I actually still come across this in work today, where product managers, especially if you're trying to deliver complex software, they often make the mistake of asking how much time is it going to take, which is a pretty counterintuitive and generally not a helpful question to ask. The success metrics, in my opinion, see better outcomes when you're asking a different question. You're asking what are the dependencies blocking us, not how long is it going to take. Okay? And then one of the most impressive human feats of where critical path management and PERT really achieved a very complex human outcome were for the Apollo missions. So the Apollo missions basically looked at where NASA had to work with 400,000 laborers and 20,000 industrial and university contractors via punch cards. And the whole methodology uses basically a spectrum of probabilities of outcomes in terms of a pessimistic, optimistic, and mid-path outcome for all of these various complexities and deliverables that they had to achieve. And they mapped out sort of like a Monte Carlo simulation of everything that needed to be done, but they standardized it through punch cards. And by working with these 3 chains of probabilities, they proved that math can conquer chaos to a certain extent. And there's something I will elaborate a little bit more about the shortcomings of PERT and CRM. But just keep that in mind. Apollo was achieved insane complexity through a critical path methodology of project management. Okay, then very interesting, and you guys will come across this, and hopefully it grinds your gears and opens your mind when you come across this in the workplace and you have the intuition to recognize that a company is saying that they're doing one thing, but they're really doing another thing. So, waterfall, right? It was actually published by a gentleman called, I believe it was Winston Royce. And I would say it's sort of where the dark ages of project management started. It's widely cited incorrectly because most people just read the first page. So that gentleman over there, he correctly outlined really what waterfall is. It's in the name, right? He sort of explained what a single pass approach was. And then on page 2 and for the rest of the paper, Winston argued against it. And he was actually an early proponent of the Agile iterative methodology over the waterfall methodology. But nevertheless, it was cemented by the US Military Department of Defense in 1985. And then the corporate world actually followed suit and still does predominantly today. Right? So we find ourselves sort of going through the dark ages of just a linear waterfall workflow methodology. And then in 1990, after a few decades of bureaucratic processes just continued to unfold in the workplace, we started seeing a lot of engineering pushback. So a rebellion against all of the bureaucratic docs required to deliver a project. Engineers and financial professionals in many organizations wanted to deliver outcomes without necessarily needing to prepare massive manual spec docs to get there. Okay? And just a fun way to remember the Scrum methodology is Harvard Business Review actually got the term from rugby, right? So it's the whole concept of the team passes the ball and they collectively move downfield together. So the term Scrum actually comes from South African rugby. Okay? And that's where we started waking up again to Agile. And then in 2001, the Agile Manifesto was officially born. And you basically see a whole history of it unfold. And this is where the corporate world starts waking up again to democratized visibility, essentially. So a Kanban board on the wall, anyone walking past should be able to see the status and contribute to the problem solving. So it's very interesting. It might not mean much to you right now, but when you start collaborating with people in a workforce, these concepts will resonate with you a little bit more powerfully. And I think one of the most important things that you have to remember about Agile is it removes the manager strictly as the gatekeeper of progress. Okay? So keep that in mind. Then we get to 2010. But before 2010, are there any questions? Maybe some underlying concepts that people have missed? Yes?
For the waterfall method, obviously, so it's just like a straight line. So if one stage in the method fails, do you have to basically go from the start again?
I think that's a good question. So if any of the parts of the method fails, what happens in a waterfall outcome? In fact, I actually have a diagram here to explain this. Okay, so on the left here, we've got a waterfall model where you can basically see we've got requirements gathering, system design, implementation, integration and testing, deployment, and maintenance. When you have this top-down approach and you have a linear outcome-based model, what will happen is you'll hit a blocker, and I think instead of necessarily claiming failure outright, you'll typically have managers and leadership point out certain, well, it's actually later in the slides, motivating for more budget to tackle problems that were not foreseen in the beginning. Because the main problem with the waterfall work methodology is it claims that it can foresee everything in the planning process. And the moment you come across something that was not foreseen, you technically either fail or you have to motivate more budget, in a way forcing you to go back to prior steps and restart the process. Whereas with an agile methodology, you expect to fail. You plan for an exploratory process where you basically anticipate you're not going to know what is going to appear when you're solving these complex things. So, yeah, I think the modes of failure look different in waterfall, but it doesn't necessarily mean waterfall is always the wrong approach. So that's a great question, thank you. Any other questions before I carry on? Yes?
So, okay, so you say that it doesn't mean that waterfall is always the wrong approach. But in your, in the timeline, it seems like you favor agile more, or because it seems to help most companies do better. So what sort of circumstances would waterfall be more appropriate than agile?
Oh, I love that. That's such a good question. I was hoping for that question. So I'm going to give you 2 chocolates. Because seriously, I was hoping for that question. Cool. All right, cool. So agile isn't always right, and waterfall isn't always wrong, okay? And this is a very important thing that I also recently learned, by the way, because I thought I knew a lot about agile, and then I got invited to give this lecture, and then I read through the literature, and I was like, wow, okay, there's a lot that I don't know. So the corporate culture that I come from, personally, waterfall is like a swear word, okay? So you've got teams getting all defensive when you're telling them, hey, isn't that a waterfall methodology? And often it really is a waterfall methodology, and it's not a swear word. So Harvard Business Review actually published a very interesting paper, authors Snowden and Boone. Paper's titled A Leadership Framework for Decision Making, and it actually outlines a spectrum of when you should be basically when you should be using waterfall versus agile. So I'm going to try and get this thing on the screen. Let's see if this thing has a light. Is that the light? Lamp. Cool. Can you guys see? Ooh, no. That's blurry as all heck. Do you use it often, Prof?
Not often.
Not often. But basically, the paper argues that you come across, well, leaders in particular, come across. Let me try this. Let me try one page. Maybe that's better. No, it's not looking good. Okay. There's a whole spectrum that you navigate as a leader in terms of when you decide to use a waterfall versus an agile methodology. So the problems you guys are going to face as you eventually become leaders, ooh, that looks good, is there's a whole spectrum. I hope you guys can actually read my handwriting. I wasn't expecting to actually present my notes. But the spectrum of the problems you solve as a leader ranges from problems that are obvious, complicated, complex, chaos.
Can you see or not?
I don't expect you to be able to read my handwriting, but I'll just point and pretend like you guys can read it. So the spectrum basically goes obvious. So you sense, categorize, respond. These are the type of situations, especially I guess if you're entering sales, where cause and effect are known by everyone, and you're basically just responding to an SOP. a standard operating procedure. Okay? So for example, processing a home loan. Then you enter the complicated realm where you have to sense, analyze, respond. The complicated realm is basically Waterfall's home, especially for industry experts. So it's where cause and effect are knowable, typically via experts. And in many cases, it's perfectly appropriate to use a waterfall approach as well as a Gantt chart to drive forward a solution on something that is knowable. Okay? So sometimes it's really not appropriate to use Agile. Agile is strictly reserved for the domain of the complex. So complex is where cause and effect are only visible in hindsight. So as you move towards this whole problem solving and collective outcome, you probe, you sense, and you respond, and you use emergent practice. For any of you who also plan on starting your own business one day, going the entrepreneurship route, there are a lot of unknowns that you're inevitably going to have to use Agile for. So think of Agile also as an emergent practice, right? For example, building the Easy Equities app. Very complex, right? We didn't know what we were going to face. There was no way in hell we would have been able to do that linearly. We do it in bits of pieces, we iterate, we figure out what we don't know, and then we respond. There's also an interesting part of the spectrum called chaos. This paper actually very interestingly explained this scenario where the mayor of Chicago had to respond to a dude who walked into a coffee joint, like a cafe, and he murdered 5 people. And obviously the entire community was panicked, and he had to respond in a context which is not even considered complex, but it's chaos. So cause and effect is not discernible. Basically, all you have to do is act, sense, and respond. And you're in a place where you're trying to merge the situation into a state where it's no longer chaos and it is complex. So another good example is, you guys can't even see the bottom, sorry. Another good example is cause and effect in a cybersecurity breach. If someone is doing a DDoS attack on you, there's no playbook, strictly speaking, for how to respond to a cybersecurity attack. So you do what you can, you try and create order, and you basically solve these problems on demand. Cool.
So is there ever a stage where the waterfall approach is more ideal than an agile approach in a dynamic environment? So where the agile approach is not best and it's better to follow a systematic method?
I think you're always going to be in a dynamic environment, I guess. I feel like maybe that's not necessarily true. I think, honestly, if you use the heuristic of cause and effect are knowable, then yeah, you could say that is a home for waterfall. I can give you an example of a project that I recently did. Let me just switch over to that project, if I can. Let me just skip through this. Oh, and that's a good question. Here you go. So here's an example of where waterfall is perfectly appropriate in, let's say, a type of Gantt setting. So one of the things I had to do was I had to make one of our apps distributable via Windows. Okay? Cause and effect were very knowable, and there were phases of the implementation that AI could code, right? And there were phases of the implementation that me as the human had to carry out. And in order to really navigate the complexity of making a certain app available for Windows, it was laid out as a process in a Gantt chart with dependency lines, checking how the sequences fall on top of each other. In that scenario of a very discernible outcome, Gantt, waterfall, very appropriate. So you do get, and I think honestly, when you guys are preparing for year test 2 and those kind of things, you can you understand the ambit of what you're going to face in the test, including the content of my talk now, and you plan accordingly. Cool. Any other questions? Yes.
I think my question is based on implementation. I think I'm currently working, and one thing that I've noticed is that the methodologies can be, like, you can know them, but the implementation part is quite hard to get through, especially if the corporate culture is not receptive to change. So how do you get to a workplace and say, this is what I have, and I want us to implement it? How can I effectively do that?
That is a very difficult thing to solve, especially if you're entering a very big corporate company. And I might not have the right answer for this question, but honestly, the best way to create sway in a company, especially a very big company, is you're going to have to start building influence. A little bit of politics, I think, to be honest, because if you're an entry-level employee joining a very large organization and you're speaking against the rigidity of the way they do things, they're just not going to listen to you. So, look, sometimes companies, and when you enter a company, most of you are going to enter different companies, and you're going to see vastly different things. Don't assume that your company's work methodology is waxed. No company has a perfect work methodology, so keep that in mind, and don't delude yourself into thinking their way is the right way. That's actually a difficult question to answer. I hope my answer is correct, but take it with a pinch of salt. Okay, which brings me to your question is very much tied to the next node and the whole concept of fake Agile. Okay, so when we're talking about fake Agile, one of the terms they sometimes use is water scrum fall. So massive companies, they co-opt for Agile, adopting the terminology, sprints, stand-ups, but they keep that top-down control. You're going to see this in big banks. Cool? And then they're basically using Agile ceremonies to a certain extent, but they're really just following a different type of waterfall practice. On top of that, fake Agile manifests itself into digital traps. So you get tools like Jira, for example. It replaced the sticky notes on the wall, but instead it moved into the digital realm. And in order to get there, you need to have a Jira profile, for example. You need to have authentication. There's role-based access control. And there's layers upon layers of pages that people don't necessarily navigate to. So these digital Kanban tools can be great for remote settings, but work is generally hidden behind a lot of filters, dashboards, and complexity. And then another thing that, especially Agile experts, the people who invented Agile in 2001, who are still alive, by the way, many of them, they speak of the certification industrial complex, where Agile started becoming an industry of certifications rather than a mindset. So, which shifts the project power back to the certificate holders. So that's a very interesting thing. And I guarantee you're going to come across fake Agile. Companies that started Agile as a startup may find themselves, as they go from startup to scale up, being less agile. That might be a necessary evil, but it is definitely something that happened. So a little bit of a backstory about my experience is I entered a startup landscape, a very small team with highly intelligent software engineers, and we followed the Agile methodology to build an investment platform, specifically a crypto investment platform, right? That's where we started. Our philosophy was move fast and break things. Shoot from the hip, just go. Sort of a high-risk approach, which is an ethos also very much adopted in Silicon Valley. That work methodology is not always appropriate, especially when you are working in sensitive financial systems. So we built this crypto asset investment platform with certain terms that if you integrate with the authentication of easy equities, this is now literally my story, and you meet certain cybersecurity milestones, you guys pass and you get acquired by us. Easy Equities being the parent company, and then we were actually a small startup that got acquired with a milestone of integrating into the broader app. Then come the scale-up journey, which is where stepping into a larger organization from a startup, built a platform that became part of the broader app. I find these necessary evils, I like to call them necessary evils, because I think they are, especially when you're working with hypersensitive financial systems. Things tend to feel a little less agile. The bigger you get, and then also the more sensitive stuff you build. Sometimes you want to have bureaucratic processes to keep things safe. A great example of keeping things safe, which is a cadence killer, slows down speed, is multisig. If you want anything sensitive to get signed off and completed, you need multiple signatures to basically get that across the line. Okay, now we're entering a new paradigm of work, and not only the way humans collaborate across complex systems with digital tools, but we are now entering the landscape of large language models and AI. When I completed my master's, I was manually typing the entire thing. Every single word. That was in 2020 to 21. That was a lot of work. Now you can use AI to actually polish your thinking. They actually did studies recently where they showed the outcomes of students both using AI and which students actually prospered academically in scenarios that required intellect and sovereign problem solving without AI. And it turns out the students that did the best were the students that used AI, but they prompted the AI to be their tutor. Whereas the students who did not do well were the students that prompted the AI for the answers directly. So things are changing. You guys are in a completely different, interesting landscape where you actually have an opportunity to be smarter than my cohort was, because you have a highly flexible AI intelligence that can cater itself to your learning routine, basically a real-time tutor. So I hope you guys are leveraging that. Anyway, come 2024, and there's an entirely new bottleneck in software. We no longer rely on software engineers to write the code. Okay? Writing code was one of the most difficult professions that existed. Knowing the syntax required very smart people to grind out a binary, very complicated language with loops and classes and functions. But now AI can do that for you, and it can especially speed up the rate at which software engineers can write code. So the new bottleneck in the age of AI has gone from human execution speed to context provision speed. The rate at which you can actually give your AI the right context to solve the problem. Context is now arguably the most important aspect of agile work and the way in which we interact with AI. So the new paradigm in which AI is rapidly becoming part of the workforce is we have these Kanban boards where people get assigned work, and now you've got a pair. Every person has an AI agent assisting them in solving complex problems. So that's a very interesting relationship where your output sort of gets bolstered. And really the interesting thing that comes from that is not only the work being assigned to humans who amplify their work with AI, but we're quickly moving towards end-to-end work being assigned to autonomous agents with personas. Right? So autonomous agents with personas, agents who can execute tasks, agents who we give mandates to. We say, your name is Ben, you are the chief operating officer of this new product, you have to interact with humans. Once a day, you have to ask humans these questions. You have to gather the context, and you have to deliver a certain type of informational mandate. So that's very much where the work landscape is going, especially with the rapid adoption of AI in the private sector. Cool. So basically, the history that we've looked at has gone from managing workers to managing work to managing tools, and now what we're coming across in the workforce is managing the AI. And this is the worst it'll ever be in terms of the level of intelligence we have access to in AI. So yeah, these are just sort of some screenshots when we were appreciating how NASA solved the complexity of the Apollo missions. They did it using this critical path method, and they used statistical outcomes to basically manage insane complexity. But there was one caveat. I do find the critical path method very interesting. But before I move on to that, any other questions? Yes, sir.
You said earlier how AI has made coding other complex systems way easier to use. Doesn't that add to making the business more bureaucratic, as you said? And, so wouldn't that assist in waterfall approaches, or it doesn't matter in the first place?
That's a good question. I feel like because AI, especially if you use some of the more intelligent models, it's really good at fathoming the landscape of the complexity. And something that may have been warranted as or necessitated as an agile problem-solving methodology for a human may very well be outlinable as a waterfall approach with AI. So the Gantt chart that I've shown you, for example, the moment you give AI visibility to your Kanban board, specifically if you're using some of the more expensive frontier models, you as an individual human with limited context and intelligence and problem-solving capabilities would by virtue of nature be would be forced actually to solve that problem with an agile approach. But a clever agent that has the world's knowledge at its fingertips could outline the processes of that step through a waterfall lens for you. So what I think the answer to your question is, the bar of where agile is appropriate, the bar of where that line is, has been raised. I really think it's been raised. So the complexity, let's call it the complexity ladder, and the line at which you decide to do things via agile and waterfall because of AI assistance and the ability for AI to map things out for you on a Gantt chart, you may actually end up seeing waterfall methodologies be way more prevalent, especially where it's a problem that is discernible. The landscape of the complexity is fully discernible via a deep research report conducted by Opus. Opus being an LLM. I'm actually burning through time like crazy. Holy cow. Anyway, thanks for the question. Any other questions? No questions. Oh, there we go.
So I have a question, but it's actually not related to the work.
Sure.
What software do you use for?
I'll share the QR code for this. Is actually an open source project, which I have the privilege of being a part of a team, a different team that's building it. So I've decided to use the software that another team, of which I'm actually a shareholder of, is building this software, which is a Kanban board, which writes tickets to your desk, right? So I can actually show you. The way we communicate with the agent and the Kanban board is through WhatsApp. Our agent's name is Ben Evans. So theoretically, he is the CEO of a company, okay? And what Ben does is you message Ben in WhatsApp, and Ben will write tickets to the board and assign it to the members of that team. So, in fact, while we're on that question, I did prepare a QR code for anyone that's interested in downloading it. It's completely open source. It's also free forever. The philosophy of the project is the Kanban board is free forever. Basically what you can do is you can point your AI to the tickets, and the tickets are literally just a folder on your disk, on your device. And you can theoretically tell that AI to formulate a study plan for you when you give it your syllabus. It can sequence the events for you on a Gantt chart. It's only available on desktop. It's not a mobile app. But for those of you who are interested, it's an app called Kanban Pro. And yeah, a South African homegrown software initiative. Cool. Any other questions? No other questions?
Oh,
Yeah?
so let me ask, if you're a shareholder and the source is free, how do you generate your cost?
We currently don't make money off of it.
The well-being of the economy and the academic.
We don't know. Honestly, the team working on this is a team that I think has long-run intentions of creating a revenue model that charges enterprise clients for using it, but getting reach by making it open source. So it's already actually got a few thousand downloads as a result of it being completely free to the general public. But the license agreement of the app, the company is not even in a position to be making revenue yet because they haven't built a funnel for capturing revenue. But the model behind the company is it's free for small teams, but then the moment you go into an enterprise environment, then the license agreement stipulates that you should pay. I don't even know how that would be enforced. So these are problems that actually, again, they're exploratory in nature, and the project itself, which is a little bit meta, is being built through that lens. I do want to just talk on something important in the last 10 minutes that I have you. I think it's pretty important, especially for you guys. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Okay, so have you guys gone through the behavioral finance part of your course yet? Yes? No? Not part of you haven't crossed that part of this? Oh, okay. Okay, very interesting. Yeah, so, man, I wanted to go through more papers with you guys. I really didn't think I would burn through all this time so quickly. I've got a whole stack of so many cool concepts, but I completely misjudged the amount of time that this would take. So how much time do I have? I've technically got 15 minutes. Okay, let's see what I can do. So we've already answered the question of when Agile is appropriate, right? Some of the questions that I also asked while doing this is, what is a good heuristic for what to focus on during sprint planning? There are academic answers to that question, but generally companies know what problems to solve. So I'm not going to answer that question with you guys right now. A very interesting question that is very relevant to the things that I'm presenting as well as what you'll face is the question of how do projects fail? Okay, so it turns out projects fail in very predictable ways. So a paper from Oxford University showed this very elegantly. They basically looked at 16,000 mega projects over 90 years of data across 100 countries. 47.9% delivered on budget, 8.5% of the companies delivered on budget and on time, and 0.5% actually delivered on budget, on time, with the projected benefits. So if we go back to the Apollo mission, and we specifically look at a concept called iron law, it was also true for the Apollo mission, which is also why humans moved beyond the critical path method, is there will always be a trade-off across the spectrum of scope, time, and cost. So you can pick any two. You can have fast, cheap, good. You can have two of those three. But you can never have all of them. And what NASA showed with 400,000 laborers and getting a man to the moon is they did it well. They got They got us there. It certainly wasn't cheap, and it was reasonably fast. It actually delivered ahead of time, but it was not cheap. So that's very interesting. And then where it ties to very much the FIN701 syllabus is where the behavioral elements of this type of stuff comes into play, right? So there are several failure modes. From this paper in particular, there are 2 failure modes. You've got optimism bias, right? Which is a very innocent mistake. We genuinely believe this time our complex project will be better, right? And then you've got strategic misrepresentation, which is just the way the world works in terms of incentives. So your sponsors or the people trying to win a contract, they will lowball the costs, they will oversell the benefits so that they can get the approval or the tender. And this produces what the author called inverted Darwinism, where the unfittest projects get selected and funded over better ones because they look more attractive on paper, right? So that's very relevant, especially when we look at the landscape of your syllabus. So what's happening in your syllabus, specifically the behavioral finance element of your syllabus, speaks about the planning fallacy. So what is the planning fallacy? Does anyone know? No one's read about it in their syllabus yet. Okay, there's still one more chocolate up for grabs, eh? I'm hoping I can keep it. So planning fallacy speaks to the notion that humans systematically underestimate complexity and overestimate predictability. Okay? It is also very much outlined in the paper. Then, very, very important is sunk cost fallacy. Does anyone know what sunk cost fallacy is? Yes.
It's like when you already incur the costs, you don't really want to let go of the project because you put so much resources in it. So you just continue instead of saying, it's got a losses and move on.
Nice, thank you for answering. That's correct. So an example of a sunk cost fallacy is we've been running sprints for 40 weeks. We can't change the architecture of what we're doing. Please pass that to her. And many other scenarios you'll find in business where this fallacy substantiates very bad decisions with many millions of rands. Okay, and then finally, a very relevant fallacy that impacts the situations that companies find themselves in terms of moving in the right direction or in the wrong direction of how humans collaborate is authority bias. Does anyone know what authority bias is?
I might be wrong, but is it the tendencies for employees to just, if I say, follow the words and the actions of someone that's in authoritative figure, assuming that they're correct because they're in that position? Correct.
Yes. So for example, the product manager's Gantt chart is trusted over the team's knowledge. Spot on. So these are very relevant. So I'd recommend please keep that in mind. Okay. So maybe I have time to just show you my equation. Do I have time? Yes, I have a little bit of time. Okay, so behavioral finance explains a part of it. This is actually ending very nicely in terms of time. So behavioral finance explains a part of why companies go wrong in terms of how they approach the systems in which humans collaborate. But there are other forces that drive the grain against Agile. So where the literature actually outlines this very nicely is a paper by Melvin Conway. It's a very old paper, actually. It's titled, How Do Committees Invent, right? And he's a pioneer in the space, and it's worth noting, especially if you're going to do masters in research, a lot of academia doesn't know a lot of academia. So concepts get rediscovered through different authors. Like you find very similar overlapping concepts throughout. But this one stuck. Very interesting. It's not always referenced by later works. But they later coined Conway's work here, Conway's law, which says the system you build will end up looking like the org chart of those who built it, right? So there's this bias towards your building for your own system. And you can use that line of thinking as a tool to design the organization you want to produce the system you want. So the systems you're building typically mimics your pre-existing communication structures. It's a very interesting concept because the way in which we at Easy Equities also motivated our organogram was through a book called Agile People. So our CEO, Charles Savage, I actually spoke to him in the office. I was like, Charles, can you just give me like one reference, please, for my talk on Agile, because he knows a lot about Agile. And he said, check out Agile People. And then I made the link between Conway's work and Maria Thorin's work. But basically, you cannot run an Agile corporation with an industrial HR structure. And this is the point I want to conclude on, because it's maybe worth challenging this. I don't have a legitimate answer on this, and it's my opinion, so take it with a pinch of salt. But the key takeaway here is sort of the environment kind of always wins the war, right? So if you have a PlayStation 5 at home and you're meant to be studying, just the fact that the PS5 is there and you can jam, odds are you're going to jam, and the environment is eventually going to win, and you're not going to study as much versus literally dropping the PS5 off at someone else's house. You're creating the environment. The odds, the decision landscape changes because the environment has changed, right? So the concept I want to conclude on is banks, for example. I'm sure many of you are going to end up in banks. You have to recognize that they have notoriously rigid functional silos. They've got a front office, middle office, back office, risk compliance, IT, finance. You cannot make a bank agile by retraining people in Scrum while leaving the legacy organogram and silos intact. That's sort of the point the paper's making, and it's also later the point that Maria made in her book, Agile People. Right? So Conway's law guarantees the org chart will reassert itself, and the environment always wins. Okay? So this really got me thinking a lot, and I hope it got you guys thinking. If I had more time, I would have riffed on this for much longer. I have 3 more minutes. Are you guys willing to give me 3 more minutes? All good. Okay, so if you look at hierarchies and systems with rigid silos, and this is probably a discussion I'm going to have with Prof when I see him again. If you look at academia as well, you have these rigid departmental silos. And I guess there's kind of a case to be made, or a discussion to be had, about whether there should be more interoperability between these academic silos, cross-department collaboration. I don't know what cross-department collaboration looks like at Tux. You would know.
Huge emphasis currently.
Huge emphasis.
Yeah, going through multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary type of thing.
That's very positive.
Through silos. So solving societal problems, not in silos. Collaborate with other departments.
Okay, cool. I wanted to ask you that, so that's great to hear. What I wrote here, I don't think I have enough time to explain, to be honest. So I think I'll kill it here, and then hopefully you guys learned something. I've got one thing. There's one thing. Okay. The whole concept of why your team should ideally be the size that one pizza can feed the size of your team. So the academic and the mathematical background behind that are specifically 2 laws that are worth paying attention to. The first is Metcalfe's law, right? I actually first came across Metcalfe's law when I was trying to value the value of a blockchain system in crypto assets, but it very much speaks to the number of nodes that connect a system. The reason why Agile is so powerful is it encourages these small teams to collaborate. The reason you can't collaborate across teams, let's say bigger than 7 people, or the reason why things get messy, is because the number of communication nodes get exponentially larger as the size of your team grows. So if N is the number of team members, then the number of communication channels, let's say in a team of 3, if you sub in 3 for N, the number of communication nodes is 1, 2, 3, right? But that's just the number of nodes. Reed's law builds on this concept that says things get even more exponentially chaotic the bigger your teams get because of the number of combinations in which these collaborations can manifest. So the number of collaborations, even though there are 3 communication nodes here, grows exponentially larger than Metcalfe's law because it doesn't just ask the question of connected nodes. It asks the questions of how do pairs of users in that system or participants in that system, how many combinations exist of collaboration. And basically these laws show that the moment the number of team members in your team reaches 7, 8, 9, you go from 10, 50, 90 to thousands of different communication channels. And that's why when you have these very big organizations with tons of people, thousands of people, you're inherently confined by the mathematics of Metcalfe's law for the number of communicating nodes and Reed's law, the number of combinations in which a lot of people can collaborate. So I thought that was a cool little mathematical way to end my lecture. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Peter.
Thank you, Prof.
Insightful lecture. I hope the students enjoyed. I particularly like how you dovetails the waterfall and the other methods, and even how it will connect with our FIN701, especially capital budgeting.
I tried. When you messaged me, you were like, please tie it in.
No.
I was like, yo, okay, let me try my best. Cool.